I first read Hamlet, maybe like some of you, when I was in high school. And I remember thinking at the time, it was in my AP English class, and, you know, like a lot of students, I sort of dreaded this idea of reading this old play in this old language. And, you know, once you get into it, I thought about how, oh, well, it's, you know, there's murder and there's revenge and there's a sword fight, and, well, that's all kind of cool. So, okay, you know, I'm okay with going through that. But I didn't really take the time or the energy to really dive into it like I probably should and could have. And so I really took it in on a surface level. And then I read it about 10 years later when I was in grad school, and I was a little older and wiser and experienced the world a little bit more, and had lived on my own for a while, met a whole bunch of different people. I had started a career, and so my perspective on the world had changed a bit. And upon reading for a grad school class on Shakespeare's plays, I learned a little bit more. This play revealed itself a little bit more to me, and I felt like I was starting to get it a little bit better, especially on the language front. About 10 years after that, I started talking about teaching this with Dr. Bryson, and so I had to dive back into it again. And again, a little older, unfortunately, more wise, more experienced, and the play reveals even more to me as I continue reading it over the years. So for those of you who maybe just read it in high school, or maybe you didn't, and this is your first experience, I want you to keep in mind that it's something that, because of its tremendous depth, it takes some time to work through it. And you know, there is some reason to be slightly intimidated by it. It is a tough work, but don't let this reading be your last reading, is what I'm trying to say. Give it a shot, dive into it the best you can, and then try, if you can, to revisit it over time, and you'll see how it keeps revealing itself to you. It's like all great literature is like scripture in that way. You know, when we read it when we're a teenager, we're like, okay, yeah, I kind of get the salvation, creation stuff, all right, fine. But it's when you're older and you start finding even more that applies to your life, suddenly becomes a lot more relevant. Well, that's what great literature does too. So we don't want to blur the line, or we don't want to keep them separate. And we're like, oh, scripture, we take that seriously, but this other stuff, oh, it's just fluff. I don't really care about it. It's not that important. No, it's really important, okay? It teaches us a lot about who we are, where we came from, and that's what the best works of literature do. There's a saying that we don't just read great literature reads us. And nothing could be more true than when we're talking about Shakespeare. We often think, well, okay, the professor's making me read this book, this play, this poetry, whatever it is, and we think, all right, you're so famous. Teach me. Show me what you've got. Let me see just how famous and powerful you supposedly are. And that's sort of how we might take in these old works. When maybe it's the other way around. Maybe it's the reverse of that. Maybe this book, this play, this poetry, this whatever it is, this piece of art, is actually looking at you going, what do you got? You think you're ready for me? I've been around for 400 years. The smartest people in the world all kind of agree that I'm pretty good, so I don't have to prove myself to anybody. Maybe you need to prove yourself to me. Let's see how smart you are. Let's see if you're brave enough to tackle the language that I'm about to give you. Let's see if you're tough enough to wrestle with the complexity that my main character is about to throw at you. Maybe that's the challenge. So when you think about great literature, whether it's in this class or in any other class, that's the perspective maybe we should have is, yeah, there's a feeling of being intimidated sometimes by these old works, but maybe we should look at it as a challenge to figure out, what's this person trying to say, the author, the character, whoever it is? How can I apply it to myself? What can I learn about myself through this process, as well as about the rest of the world? And that's a tremendous challenge, and I hope you're willing to do that this week. If you haven't dived in already, hopefully today's discussion will entice you to give it a shot. I'm going to talk to you about some very big, broad ideas, and perhaps next time we'll start getting into more of the focused scene-by-scene questions you may have. So today is going to be a bit of a broad overview. I'm actually going to talk, we'll see if I get to it all, about the whole text. So even if you haven't gotten to those points in the text yet, I'm not meaning to spoil it for you, but you should probably already guess what's going to happen. But that's the way it's going to go, is a sort of broad overview today, and then some narrowed, more detailed discussion perhaps on Thursday. All right? So I've named my lecture, I couldn't really come up with a title, but I thought this would suffice. Inventing the Modern Man. There's a book by Harold Bloom, who's a Yale professor and literary critic who's written like dozens of books. He's super famous. And he wrote a book that's like this thick called Shakespeare, the Invention of the Human. He actually theorizes or proposes a thesis that until Shakespeare's writings came along, we really didn't know what the human looked like, particularly in the artistic world, in this case, the literary world. It took his writing to fully clarify what humanity really is, because up to that point, though we've had literature for a very long time, it wasn't fully explored. Most of the older literature wasn't as deep and complex and indicative of real humans as Shakespeare's writing. And so that's an interesting way of thinking about it. I think there's an additional twist, which is there's a great element of modernity to it. I know it's hard to think of the 1600s as being modern, but it is. And as we'll talk about today, there's some tremendous historical components that go into this. So I think I'm more comfortable being a little more detailed than Bloom is with, he's not just inventing the human, he's specifically inventing the modern person. And hopefully we can see why that is as we talk today. So in that book, this is what Bloom says. So what does it mean to be a human, really, especially on the page? He says, the idea of character, of the self as moral agent, has many sources. Homer and Plato, Aristotle and Sophocles, the Bible, St. Augustine. These are pretty familiar texts, I would assume. Dante and Kant, and all you might care to add. Personality, in our sense, is a Shakespearean invention. It's not only Shakespeare's greatest originality, but also the authentic cause of his perpetual pervasiveness. Insofar as we ourselves value and deplore our own personalities sometimes, we are the heirs of Falstaff and Hamlet and all the other persons who throng Shakespeare's theater of what might be called the colors of the spirit. Again, up until Shakespeare's time, most characters in plays were sort of just stand-ins for the plot and for the theme, and there really wasn't much depth. Bloom argues, and I would agree, that Shakespeare creates the fully realized human being on the stage and on the page. And that changes art and literature forever. Along with that is a quote from another author, a social scientist who I'll dive into later, where he says, great students of human nature could see behind the masks of men long before scientific analysis. We might think, living in our modern world, postmodern world, that, well, everything we know we've learned in the recent years because of advancements in science and technology. And in fact, artists and literary figures, musicians, poets, these people have been studying human nature forever. In fact, they knew all this already. There's a joke that everything Freud came up with in the end of the 1800s and early 1900s, yeah, Shakespeare already thought of that 300 years earlier. The artists and the literature creators are at the forefront of understanding humans. And sometimes it takes the scientific method a while to catch up to that. And you're going to see how Shakespeare is ahead of everybody in truly understanding what it means to be a person. And Hamlet is his perhaps greatest example of that. So those are two sort of disparate quotes I want us to think about as we dive in to this famous play. You might think that when you hear the word Hamlet, you may already know what it's about, even though you've never read it. You might instantly have these images of famous actors, like the ones on the screen who have portrayed Hamlet, and of course there's many, many, many more. You may have heard little bits and pieces of the story. You might know little bits and pieces of the theme. Again, without even having to read it, it's become what Jung calls part of our collective unconscious. You kind of already have it built into you almost, even though you haven't experienced it yourself. And that's fine, that's good. You know, it's good to take in some of these examples and portrayals of people who have done it on stage and screen. Obviously some very famous people up there. But I want us to see if we can get past that and go past our initial reactions to a play like Hamlet, because it's so famous and we already might have these images in our mind or these hypotheses about what this play is all about. I want us to look at it with fresh eyes as much as possible. Even if it's your second or third time reading it, see if you can look at it anew and see what we can get out of it, and try to avoid letting these famous figures who have presented this famous play over the years, see if we can avoid letting them influence us, and let's see what we can do ourselves through it. We may be familiar with is the line right at the beginning from where Hamlet is talking to Horatio, and he says, "There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, than are dreamt of in your philosophy." And in the text, it's actually meant to be natural philosophy, and at the time, natural philosophy meant science, because Horatio's a scientific thinker. And Hamlet tells him, there's more to this world than what you think you can study and test and measure. There's ultimate truths, right, that are about humans, that are about the divine. You can't just measure everything. That doesn't make you the most intelligent person. Hamlet knows that. And in fact, we learn with him as the play goes on. So that's where I want us thinking is, what is true about this play, and how might that truth influence us? So let's start at the beginning of how this fits into the genre. It's interesting that Hamlet's father died the same year that Hamlet is produced, becomes played on the stage, the same year. Also, just I think 4 years, maybe 5 years before that, Shakespeare's own son, at age 11, passes away. So for the years leading up to the writing of Hamlet, we have a guy in Shakespeare who is dealing with death of the people he cares about the most, his father and his son. So maybe it's no surprise, perhaps, that here's a play about fathers and sons and dealing with death. Now, we can't always attribute an author's personal life to what shows up on the page, but we could certainly guess that that is very, very likely that that's going on here. Someone who can dwell for all these pages on death clearly has some things going on, all right? He's gone through something, and those are the things that come out in these characters. However, as I said, this isn't the first revenge tragedy. Ancient myths have been telling these types of stories for a very long time. In fact, interestingly enough, the first story, what many believe to be the first story that we know of as a documented narrative from about 5,000 years ago now, is an old Egyptian story. And what's the story about? It's about a father who's a king who gets killed by his brother who wants to be king, and he asks his son to avenge his death. So the very first story in human history that we have recorded is actually the same plot that Hamlet then expounds upon. So these stories are not new. They've been around for a very long time. They then stretched into many of the Greek and Roman plays. If you've taken any of those, whether they're Greek courses or ancient literature classes, or maybe from even high school, world literature classes, you may have remembered some of those tragedies that were perhaps based on revenge. So again, they're common to us. They were common to the playgoers at the time of Shakespeare. So this is nothing new. As history progresses, there's also a Norse legend, which would fit that, this takes place in Denmark. So maybe Shakespeare adapts the Norse legend and makes it sort of Englishized, if you want to say. But it's from the 12th century, and it's about the same thing, about a father who has to be avenged by his son. We also know, though there's no written record of it that survives, we also know that there was an early version of Hamlet. It's called the Hamlet now, meaning primordial, like the first draft Hamlet, let's say, and not a very good one, frankly. That was written about 14 years prior to the final product that we get in our text now. We don't know quite who wrote it. There's a debate over two authors at the time. One could have been Shakespeare's. Maybe it literally was a first draft of his that he thought about. It didn't really work. It didn't sound great, so he shelved it for a while and then came back to it later. Or another author named Thomas Kyd, who also wrote a revenge tragedy called The Spanish Tragedy. a few years later, maybe this was his first version. So we don't know, and they knew each other, so we don't know maybe if one of them saw the other's version and adapted it, if Kyd had seen a version or read a version of the first Hamlet and thought, ooh, that's a decent idea, I'm gonna borrow some of that. Spanish tragedy is slightly different. There's more comedic elements. It's not nearly as serious or deep as as Shakespeare's, but maybe he borrowed some of it. Or maybe Kyd started with it, realized it wasn't working, later revised it to be the Spanish tragedy, and Shakespeare adopted that into Hamlet. We don't quite know. We do know that, Shakespeare's son was named Hamnet or Hamlet, so we knew he wanted to work in, or he decided to work in that name, and perhaps it was based on his work or someone else's work. There was lots of borrowing of material at the time, as you can imagine. There's only so many playwrights and so many ideas, and so we could see how that could come about, that maybe Hamlet isn't a super original idea. Maybe this has just been adapted from other ideas. So in the text form, the first version of Hamlet actually gets published or printed in what's called a quarto. It's a way of the pages are folded in the little pamphlet. It's called the bad quarto because it's very incomplete. I think it's less than half of the actual length of the play we get. So there's whole sections missing. Lines are very different. It's not nearly as beautifully written. The language isn't quite as good. It definitely gets revised over time. So that's the first one that was put in print. A second version came out a few years later, and then finally what's called the first folio is the full play, corrected, updated, and that's what goes in his first collection of his famous works. So like all pieces of writing, it goes through many drafts. That's why, for those of you who had me for composition, that's why we draft a lot, is because it takes a while to get it right. And even Shakespeare, the greatest writer in history, yeah, it takes a while. It doesn't come out perfect the first time. So this is where we stand with the text we have in front of us now. Of course, it certainly doesn't stop there. We know that throughout the 1600s, revenge continues to be a key theme, and I'll come back to that when I talk about the Renaissance era. Plays that followed, actually, there was one 10 years later by another author that, and there are some other ones that were similar, where the ghost comes back and it's reversed. The ghost tells his son, don't take revenge. The son wants to, and he says, don't do it. That's God's business. You don't do that. So it's interesting to see how some of the characters actually get inverted over time, and that occurs throughout the 1600s while drama is still being churned out in England. And obviously, you probably have many revenge stories that come to your mind when you think of that genre. Perhaps they first come to you in children's animated films, same story. Maybe it comes to you in action films, similar story. These are all fathers who have died and sons who want to avenge deaths, right? Done in fairy tale comedies. Doesn't get more clear than that. And in the greatest American film ever, The Godfather. What is it about? It's about sons who are trying to decide how to avenge their father. Interestingly, it takes three characters, whereas Hamlet deals with all of it at once. The three brothers in the film are, one is very angry and aggressive. He wants to commit revenge immediately. The other is very wimpy and weak. He doesn't want any part of it. And of course, Michael Al Pacino is sort of stuck in the middle, and he's the one who has to figure out how to deal with this problem. So all of those characters come together in one Hamlet. But let's not forget that these aren't just floating out there in the literary and artistic world. These are very real. People actually choose to make these choices. If you can't see, it says Hamza bin Laden seeks revenge for his father's death. This is from a news clipping from last year. So people actually live this out. We can't just think, oh, this is just imaginary, it's just a fairy tale or a myth. No, no. These myths and fairy tales and plays and stories and poems give us guidance for how we should live, and that can be very dangerous sometimes. So that's a brief overview of how do we get to the revenge tragedy of Hamlet. And what's interesting to think of too is that playgoers at the time, they were very familiar with the revenge tragedies, and so when it's billed as a tragedy that is about revenge, these playgoers already know what's probably going to happen. They'd seen enough already that when they walk in, they go, oh, okay, this is a revenge story, got it. Everyone's probably going to die in this play. They knew that going in, okay? And yet, even when you know how the play is going to unfold, it's so powerful that we keep wanting to read it and act it out. So, that's how Hamlet came to be. The second way I think that this story has lasted so long, this is the quote where Hamlet's mocking Polonius in Act 2. Words, 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 because Polonius just keeps yakking at him. Is the linguistic style and the structure of the play, which is pretty daunting, as many of you, if you've started reading it, are aware of. Hamlet is Shakespeare's longest play. When it's performed in full, it's around 4 hours long, 4.5 maybe even. So it's a beast. It's a monster to get through. It's a lot. And Hamlet himself has more lines than any other character in any of Shakespeare's plays. So to take on the responsibility of playing that role for those actors, it is huge. You have to fully invest yourself in this play. In his language, his intelligence shines through so clearly. He's able to dive into the depths of his own soul and analyze other people so well, and it's done almost in every conversation he has, whether he's talking with another person or if he's giving a soliloquy. What's interesting about this play is that this is a bit different than how plays had been before. Not completely, there's some similarities, but in previous plays, and especially tragedies, plot was the key element, all right? It's about action, it's about plot, it's about theme. Shakespeare, though, takes a different route with Hamlet. He sort of acknowledges, look, here's a plot you've heard before. Here's a theme you might already be thinking about. I'm going to show you the people instead. And the way we see people act, truly, is we listen to them talk. We hear their words. We analyze their language. And so that's what makes this play slightly different than other plays that had come before, is the language of this play is so powerful and so interesting, you could dissect it forever, and people have. Hamlet is the most, I don't know if this is completely true, but I've heard, Hamlet is the most analyzed piece of writing in the history of the English language outside of the Bible, which is interesting to think about. So obviously it's worth examining very closely for the words that it offers. We also get to see, based on his soliloquies and some of his other interactions, how his mind works. We didn't always see that very clearly in old Greek plays. Sometimes there'd be a chorus who would kind of explain things to the audience. But here we get to actually hear Hamlet talk to the audience or talk to a camera and explain what's going on in his mind, and we can see how tortured he is based on the language he uses. What's interesting about this play is that I think it actually goes against what plays are supposed to be as an audience member. Plays, remember, are supposed to be watched. They're supposed to be performed. Plays aren't supposed to be read. It's not like people in 16th century Britain were walking around hoping to get a text of Shakespeare's play. No, they paid to go in to watch it be performed. Today it'd be like, instead of going to watch the movie at the theater, you just want to read the screenplay. You'd think, no, I want to see it, right? That's what it's all about. That's what a play is. But I think what's interesting about Hamlet is it actually benefits from reading the text, because you can slow down, you can look at each word more carefully, and that really goes against the tradition of what plays are. Yes, it's an amazing thing to watch, but I think you can actually get even more out of it when you read it closely. So what I usually do is, this is a shortcut you could take, instead of looking at Spark Notes, instead of just reading summaries or going to Wikipedia, the best thing I think to do is to sit down with a movie version of it with the text open and watch it and follow along so you can see the words being performed while you're actually reading it. So if you haven't done that already, you might want to just think about that. As I said, this is in its full complete length about 4 hours long. So you might be thinking, well, gosh, were the peasants of England really standing for 4.5 hours watching these plays? And the answer is Probably not. I think even Shakespeare knew, I got to trim this thing down to about 3 hours. That's about as much as people are willing to put up with. So what you'll see if you watch stage or film versions is you see characters talking very, very fast, okay? And that shows Hamlet's intelligence, that he can rattle off these deep thoughts instantly. But perhaps there's a logistical challenge that's being presented here too, where these actors are actually trying to get through the performance as quickly as they can. And that can be very difficult. I know when we read it or watch it, you might be thinking, I don't even understand what they're talking about. I got to slow down. And I think Shakespeare on purpose highlights his own kind of linguistic gymnastics. He tries to be creative and beautiful, but at the same time, I think he understands that, look, just get the gist of what I'm saying. It'll all make sense. Just catch the main idea, you'll get it. And that's, I think, what reading it allows us to do, as opposed to just watching it on the stage or on the screen. We can actually slow down and look at it word by word, and that makes it even more interesting to us. So I strongly encourage you to actually do that this week. In his language, again, those of us who are super nerdy English people, we kind of pay attention to these things, but I think, even if you're not used to looking for it, it shows up and it's kind of obvious. Notice how many times he uses metaphors where he compares something complex to something more simple. He uses imagery to make it clearer for our understanding. The wittiness of the interchanges. I mean, there's all these double, this wordplay. He's joking, he's mocking people. There's lots of subtle bits of comedy actually strewn through this tremendously tragic play. There's lots of oxymorons. Again, Shakespeare's trying to mix up his language. Crafty madness, defeated joy. These are words and phrases that don't go together. And yet, when he presents it, we're like, oh, I kind of understand what that means. That's a clever way of illustrating it. Lots of puns. The line Hamlet gives to Ophelia, get thee to a nunnery, where he's sort of breaking up with her. He's ditching her, and that's what breaks her heart. He says, get thee to a nunnery. Well, nunnery at the time had a double meaning, that it was literally a place where nuns lived. So he's telling her, go live in chastity, stay away from, the intimate relations and the complexities of that. Go and be alone. That's where you should be. That'll protect you. Nunnery at that time also had a meaning of being a slang term for a brothel. So is actually Hamlet digging in on her a little bit about her own sexuality. It's hard to tell. But those are the kinds of things that Shakespeare provides us. Is he makes us think twice about what his words actually mean. Another fascinating thing about the language he uses is that he actually uses, people have actually counted this, people actually do this, 600 new words that Shakespeare had never used in any of his other plays. He'd written tons of other plays by this point, and yet there are 600 brand new words he uses that he had never used in other writing. That's amazing to think about. I don't even know if I couldn't even come up with 600 other words to use in a certain situation, and he does it in this one play, along with what is estimated. You can't ever truly know this number, but many people think there might be 170, upwards to 170 new words and phrases that had never appeared, not only in his plays, but in all of the English language. He actually is inventing words and phrases in this play. So again, the skill that it takes to be creative and still have things make sense is a level of genius that is hard to comprehend. So what do you think he's trying to do by using brand new words that he didn't want to recycle all the same words he'd used in his previous plays? And in fact, he's inventing new words. What do you think the point of that is? Well, clearly, he wants there to be a freshness, a newness to this play. He wants to startle people awake and go, look, you may have watched all my other plays. This one's different. Just listen to it and pay attention, and you'll see this one is shocking and different than anything you've seen before. And he does that through words, nothing else. Lastly, what's kind of interesting also is that, again, science has to catch up. It takes a while for it to catch up, and we've recently learned that some of the techniques that Shakespeare actually employs are scientifically true in the way they affect our brains. Now, Shakespeare couldn't possibly have known that, but turns out what he was doing is actually the best way to get us to pay attention to things. When we read things that are slightly off grammatically, our brains actually perk up and pay attention. Now, those of you who are in your writing classes, it's not a license for you to go break rules of grammar because you think you're being Shakespearean and you want your author to pay attention. No, no. In creative works, you can have a little more leeway with that. But Shakespeare actually breaks some rules of grammar here. And when you do that, your brain goes, wait a second, let me read that again. Let me think about that for half a second longer. And we can actually see people's brains go blip, blip. They're rethinking it, rethinking it, rethinking it. So again, Shakespeare is clearly doing this on purpose. He doesn't know what's literally going on in your mind, but it seems like he's using our minds to our full capacity when it comes to his language. So again, I know some of it with the these and the thous in the old language. I know it's tricky to get through, but do your best to try to notice all the linguistic challenges that he's presenting and notice how amazing it is. It's truly remarkable. So there's a linguistic reading. The third way that I think this play is truly valuable is in its historical context. And that is the reading that one author gives. I'll share some quotes of them here in a second. Hamlet appears to be a play in which the main character is wrestling with the ways of old, the traditions of the past, and the new Christianized Western Europe. I know it's super small. I'll send it to you, don't worry about it. So there's a convergence between the old ways and the new ways. So what are the old ways? Well, again, we're comparing the Renaissance period to the classic era, the ancient Greeks, the ancient Romans. The Renaissance is a period of trying to bring those classical pieces of art, those classical ideas back into the modern world. But it's not so easy because the modern world has changed, right? Christianity is spread now. Different famous pieces of literature and philosophy have emerged now. People are thinking differently. So you can't just take the ways of 3,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago and bring them up to speed and go, oh yeah, this is how we should do it. Even though many people want to do that. Things have changed slightly. So when we compare the ancient Greek classicism to what's occurring in the Renaissance, there's a conflict. There's an intersection of ideas. And it seems like Hamlet might be at the middle of that. That's why maybe he's stuck. Maybe he doesn't know what to do, is because he's simultaneously trying to balance the old way with the new way. So what exactly are those? Well, this is explained very clearly in a book by a professor at the University of Virginia who's a Shakespeare scholar. His name is Paul Cantor. He has a book creatively titled Hamlet back in 2004. And if you want to know more about it, you can certainly look into it. And by the way, Paul Cantor is a lovely man. He's been gracious enough to exchange emails with me over the years on some various projects I was working on. And he's a Shakespeare scholar, but he's also an economics scholar who studied personally with one of the best economic minds of the 20th century. And he's a pop culture scholar. So he's written books that have The Simpsons and South Park and all sorts of things in it. So he's a very smart guy. And so this is his theory of what the essence of Hamlet is. That it's truly a historical problem that Hamlet is facing. So if we look back to what the traditional classic literature taught us, we might remember, again, things you read in high school or in other classes, things like the Odyssey, the Iliad, you know, those famous Greek texts from Sophocles and other playwrights. And Achilles usually was the standard for the Greek hero. From the heroic stories, he is the ultimate man. He's the ultimate warrior. If you needed to solve a problem, Achilles is your model, right? So this is what Cantor writes. He says, Achilles, in all his pride and rage, was held up as the model to Greek youth. Homer's portrait supposedly helped to fire the ambitions of Alexander the Great. The centrality of Achilles as hero within classical culture tells us something about the ancient Greeks and Romans as well, the way they prized the whole spirited side of human nature, what the Greeks called thumos, the complex of pride, anger, indignation, and ambition, which fueled the deeds of the great classical heroes in fact and in fiction. So that's been the model. And the Renaissance, if we're thinking of returning to what the classics were, art starts to look more classic, literature is trying to be more classic. Okay, well, what does that truly mean? Well, it means acting more like Achilles. And if you're Achilles and you're faced with someone who has wronged you or killed your father or done something horrible to your country or whatever it is, you go to war, you fight. That's the classic way of handling it. That's what heroes do. But in the Renaissance, something else has changed since then, right? Christianity has spread across Europe. England is now Christianized. Most of Europe is that way now. Denmark is that way now. So it's not so easy to just be violent and angry all the time because we've been taught differently over the years. So this is what happens. Look at the contrast. Jesus, in every respect, is the antithesis of the classical hero. He's humble rather than proud, merciful rather than vengeful, passive rather than aggressive, forgiving of sins rather than unyielding in hatred. In classical terms, one might question whether there is in fact anything heroic at all about Jesus. But the tendency of Christianity is to redefine heroism so that suffering misery becomes a higher or deeper form of heroism than inflicting misery. Right? Being patient, merciful, forgiving, rather than just being angry and vengeful all the time. So, if you start thinking of it in terms of what the Renaissance period was, broadly speaking, we can start to see, oh, maybe this is what's going on in Hamlet's mind and why he's so conflicted and he doesn't quite know what to do. It's not that he's frozen because he's weak or that he's incapable of doing anything. It's because he's truly going through a crisis of what his culture has presented to him. On the one hand, I've got the past that's telling me, fight back. But on the other hand, I've got the spread of the church and the newer philosophies that have emerged that say, no, leave that to God. You stay the path, you be patient, you be the bigger person, let the Lord deal with that. So how do you deal with those two very powerful influences upon you? Maybe that's what's happening inside of Shakespeare's mind. You guys, I believe, read Paradise Lost. And Paradise Lost is a very similar situation, right? If you remember reading that, which I hope you did, because it's endlessly fascinating, Satan is actually sort of the hero of that story, right? At least for the first half. Why? Because he exhibits the classical hero nature. He's angry, he's taking action. Some of his arguments kind of actually make sense. Like, you can see why he's doing what he's doing. He is acting out his rebellion in a way that makes sense to him. Totally valid. But then we see in the other half of Paradise Lost, when Christ returns, that, oh, this is what heroism actually looks like. That anger and vengeance leads you on a path to ultimate darkness. Christ's heroism is the path we should actually follow. So, again, Hamlet isn't necessarily diving into anything new. Milton already explored this to a certain extent, so hopefully that clarifies some of what you read from Milton as well. Now you might think, well, yeah, we can see this because we're outside the play and we have the benefit of understanding history and we're smart, we've done the research, but you can also see that Hamlet knows this, right? He's very self-aware. That's what makes him so intelligent. So remember some of these quotes from the beginning. Or actually, this is from Act 3, but anything up to the beginning. He's talking about this all the time. In his famous To Be speech, notice what he says. Whether 'tis nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune. So he's comparing the new modern Christian way of dealing with tragedy in our life, or to take arms against that sea of troubles and by opposing end them. So he's going through the process in his own mind. He knows it. He's very aware of his own situation. And the fact that he can clearly express it is what makes him so intelligent. You can also see how he describes his father throughout the play. He constantly describes his father in Greek and Roman terms. And he actually, when the players arrive to put on their play, before he tells them what they're going to actually do, he wants to see how good their memory is and how good of storytellers they are. He asks them to recite a portion of the purest speech when Achilles' son avenges his father's death. So clearly the classic revenge model is at the forefront of Hamlet's mind. He's constantly thinking about it. He knows that's an option. But he has the other side. He has his Christian culture influencing him as well. So what Cantor writes ultimately is that what is distinctive about Hamlet is precisely that his mind is open to all the competing models of heroism available in the Renaissance. He can admire the martial virtue. He can admire the toughness, the vengeance, the anger. He gets it. And he's haunted by the thoughts of the grandeur of classical antiquity, along with Denmark's pagan past, because Denmark has gone through it, very pagan, been Christianized now. But at the same time, he is acutely aware of how Christianity has altered the terms of heroic action and called into question traditional ideas of heroism. So, as a time of synthesizing these values, the Renaissance ideal revealed the ultimate theme of tragedy. What is tragedy ultimately? That you can't do both. Some human aspirations cannot be compatible. And that's a tough choice. All right, it's not so easy. I remember when I was in high school and I read Hamlet, I thought, well, go after that guy. He killed your father. Go get him. Like, be a man, take a stand, take it over. Yeah, it's easy to say that when you're young and naive and you don't know much. When you learn a little more about the world and what the culture has created, suddenly these other thoughts start coming into your head and you're like, oh, maybe it's not so easy. And maybe that's why Hamlet waits and waits and waits, as he's trying to figure it out. We can actually see this at the very beginning, just as a quick line of dialogue. The last thing that the king, the ghost of King Hamlet says to his son when he's saying, go avenge me, he says, taint not thy mind, nor let thy soul contrive against thy mother aught. Leave her to heaven. So essentially, his father, the ghost, is saying, go, do this thing, take action, be a warrior, but don't let your mind and soul be corrupted by that. Yeah, right. Right? Yeah, try being a vengeful person and see how quickly your mind and soul deteriorate. That's what happens. So the ghost is trying to incite some action in his son while also giving him this contrasting sort of belief system. That's probably not going to work out very well, and that's why Hamlet struggles so much. So, a little bit of basic psychology, because when people read criticisms of Hamlet, this tends to be what emerges the most, and there's a lot of very interesting things, and there's a lot of not very good things out there, and so I just want to make you aware of some of those. I'm not a psychologist. I read a lot of psychology. My father's a psychology professor, so living in a house for 22 years with someone who'd come home every day and talk about what he talked about in class, a lot of it sinks in. But these are just some superficial ideas to get you thinking along these lines. Perhaps if you're majoring in psych or any of those things, this might be interesting for you. There are some really potentially useful readings if you are into Freud's id, ego, superego kinds of stuff. There's several different ways you could explore that in this play. You know, we could imagine that obviously the id portion is the emotional side, the attack side. This is the what our gut instincts or our urges want us to do. The superego side would say, no, you can't do that. That's against the law. That's bad. Stay away from that. And your ego is what tries to figure out the right answer. You can see how Hamlet, either by himself or in juxtaposition to his father, the ghost, or to Claudius, or even to other characters, wrestles with some of these id ideas and superego ideas and how his ultimate personality emerges. That's definitely worth looking at. What you'll often read if you type in psychology and Hamlet is you'll hear about the Oedipal complex. And this is something that Freud came up with that was kind of made sense, but is actually wildly wrong. So if you read criticism that tries to discuss this, you want to really, I would say, disregard it because it's not accurate. What Freud contended, based on a few lines of the play, was that, Hamlet is confused and he's stuck in the middle because he doesn't know how to act because everyone harbors these sort of latent sexual feelings regarding their parents, and that creates this confusion in your mind, and I won't go further than that, but that's essentially where it all comes from. Freud attributes a biological premise to everything that occurs psychologically. And he's sort of half right, but he's not completely right. And in fact, the correct way of thinking about that Oedipal complex, which, if you remember, comes from the play Oedipus, where there's some son and mother situations going on. The correct way, though, is to think about it more broadly, not in a biological way, but more in a developmental way. So the way that one psychologist, who I'll get to more deeply in the next section, he says that the Oedipal complex, really what you should think about it is a project that sums up the basic problem of a child's life, whether he will be a passive object of fate, an appendage of others, a plaything of the world, or whether he'll be an active center within himself, whether he will control his own destiny with his powers or not. It is the flight from passivity to conquer death by becoming the father of himself, the creator and sustainer of his own life. When you think about it that way, it starts to make a lot more sense. Hamlet is a guy who's trying to figure out, am I just are my strings just connected to my father and he's just telling me what to do? Or will I make my own decisions about how to deal with this situation? Will I become my own man and solve my own problems in the world? Or am I always a reflection of mommy and daddy? That's what children actually go through. That's what young people are actually trying to figure out about themselves. Am I just what my culture says? Am I just what my parents are? Or am I my own person? Am I the creator of myself? Suddenly that makes a lot more sense when we use the Oedipal term. One thing I want to think about that sort of relates to some of the language elements is something called theory of mind. This is something that is one of the key elements of what makes humans humans. And it shows up in literature because you can't have literature unless you have this, okay? This is why animals don't have language and they can't create art, is because of this very thing. So a theory of mind is the ability to attribute mental states, beliefs, desires, pretend, knowledge, not only to ourselves but to other people, and to understand that they have other ideas too, and in fact those ideas might be wrong, they might be in complete conflict with your own. We're the only animals that really can do that. There's been research that shows some apes can do a little bit of it, but even a 4-year-old can handle theory of mind, whereas most of the other intelligent animals on the planet cannot. So there's something special about humans, that we can do this, and that's what creates art and literature. Because to have literature, you have to be able to put yourself in other people's minds, right? You have to imagine yourself as another character. The author has to know that you can imagine yourself as another character, otherwise he wouldn't have written it. So theory of mind is one of the foundational components of why literature even exists. So when we think of that, there's a couple ways in which we can see that show up in our play here. We can see it in the soliloquies because we can get insight into Hamlet's mind, actually. That's very helpful. We can also see it when all these characters are spying on each other. Right? If you notice that everyone's constantly listening in behind walls, they're behind curtains, they're in another room. There's constant eavesdropping. Now you could read that as, well, this is a kingdom and a palace, and so there's a political connotation to that. But it's also allowing all of his characters to get glimpses into the minds of all the other characters. All right? And that's a very interesting way of structuring that technique. So we as the readers, or if we're watching the play, we constantly have access to all of these people's minds. And that's very interesting because sometimes they conflict. And so we as the audience, we become interested in that. We go, ooh, that guy knows this, but he knows that. They don't know that the other knows, and we'll see how all this pans out. That's great storytelling. And so you have to be able to know your characters have thoughts other than other characters, and the audience has to be able to see both of those. So that's what Shakespeare does so well. Here's 2 elaborate examples. These occur in the back half of the play, so you might not be there yet if you've just started. I'm not spoiling it. You'll know what it's about. But here's a couple ways to think about it. When you get to the play within the play section, we have to think about how many layers Shakespeare is creating for us here. And if you think about it this way, it becomes very fascinating and it becomes a little bit of a mind bender. So notice what happens. Obviously, Shakespeare had to create this idea. He then puts the idea into the mind of Hamlet, his character, to put on this play to catch his uncle, right? So therefore, Shakespeare has to know what Hamlet's going to do, and Hamlet is going to set up a situation where he's going to use the mousetrap actors, right? That's the play within the play, to catch Claudius. So he has to know what the mousetrap actors will do so that he can catch what Claudius has been thinking about. While that's all going on, Hamlet is watching Claudius, trying to see, am I going to catch him? Is he going to admit that he did it? All the while we are watching Hamlet, watching Claudius, and we're watching Claudius. We want to know how all this is going to unravel. So all of these characters have little pieces of information. Shakespeare obviously had all of it because he wrote it. And we have all of it because we've been hearing about the plotting throughout the whole play. But since they don't know, we get the enjoyment of trying to figure out, how is that guy going to find out what that guy knows? Is this plan going to work? Oh, she doesn't know anything. This is going to be interesting when she finds out. All of that is accessible to us, and that's what makes it, in one way, so enjoyable. And we can see how many layers we go through, that this person knows this, but this person knows that. And Shakespeare uses that to its fullest extent. There's constantly people with little bits of information that gradually get revealed throughout the play. One other example is in the final plot to kill Hamlet. Again, we start with Shakespeare because he thought of it, but notice what happens. Again, I'm not spoiling it. Claudius is going to try to kill Hamlet, okay? So he's going to poison this cup so that when Hamlet takes a drink, he's going to die. But he also poisons Laertes' sword because they're going to have a sword fight. So Claudius has a certain piece of information. Laertes has a certain piece of information. Hamlet doesn't know any of this. But when he sees Gertrude get affected by the cup, now he knows something's going on. And all the while, we know all of it. We know all of the little pieces, and we can put it together, but we're waiting to see if all the characters can put it together. The way he can balance that is incredible. And it also goes to how sophisticated our minds are, that we can handle this with no problem. This is incredibly complex, but we, as critical thinkers and have this deep theory of mind, we know exactly what's going on. So for Shakespeare to use that ability to use our brains as the audience members to its fullest capacity is quite incredible. So look for other examples of that throughout the play, either in soliloquies or when people are spying on each other and gathering little bits of information. You know all of it, but they don't, and that's the trick. So that's a little bit of how your brain's operating. This is your brain on Hamlet, so to speak. Let me finish up with just one idea, and I'll dive back into this on Thursday for a little while. One final thing. The more I've read over some of the things I'm interested in, I've seen a pattern emerge, and I think it helps us give us a clearer idea of what Hamlet's struggle might be, in addition to all the things we've already talked about. That Hamlet is facing the ultimate human existential crisis. That he knows and is very aware, because he verbalizes it, that we are all going to die. That we as humans have the unique capacity that we know that at some point this is all going to be over. And that is a really difficult thing to come to grips with. And in fact, it causes some people to really have serious mental problems with it. And so what we do is we devise ways of dealing with it, and I can talk about some of those on Thursday. But maybe that's what Hamlet's problem is because he encounters the death of his father, and because he's been awakened to this world of death, and he knows that he's going to face it soon too, and in fact, maybe he wants to do it to himself. That's what the to be or not to be speech is all about. That's a real mental struggle, and so maybe this is a play about how we deal with the fundamental human quality of knowing this tremendously scary idea that all of us are going to go. We don't know when, we don't know where, but it's going to happen. Which obviously leads to a thought of, well, if it's going to happen and I have no control over it, why do anything at all? It leads us down a path of what you might call nihilism to a certain degree. So Hamlet, I think, is struggling with that. And he clearly talks about that in many speeches, that what's the point of all this, right? But I think by the end, maybe he figures out a way that you can cope with it. And we can dive into that next time. So I want to leave you with a couple questions, and then I'm going to ask you to do a little homework for tonight, okay? As you continue reading, whether you're just starting or whether you're halfway through or whatever it is, as you're reading, think about a few questions. What do you do if someone you love and respect asks you to do something that you don't want to do? What do you do if someone you love and respect asks you to do something that you might want to do, but you don't know if you can pull it off? Maybe you're incapable of doing it. What do you do if what you do has ramifications beyond yourself? Maybe you don't know the extent of the ripple effect of it. What do you do? And then what do you do if you have no idea what to do, but you think you've got to do something? Those are deep questions, and us as young people, those are things if you haven't yet, you're going to face those at some point. Those are essential human questions. So think about that. Think of Hamlet's dilemma in this story. Think about what your decisions might be, how you would interact with these other characters. And ultimately, what can we learn from studying a story that seems so literally tragic but depressing? It's about death. What's the point of all this? What can we get out of it, even when it seems depressing and tragic?